Hi, I'm Stuart Lilford. I'm Programme Coordinator for Game Design here at the University of Hull. And I'm doing this taster session, which should hopefully give you a bit of an idea about what a lecturer at the university is like. And this one is about level design and creating interesting spaces, and some quick steps to improving a level design. So I imagine many of you might not know necessarily. You might obviously be aware of what a level is and what it might look like, but in terms of how one is put together, or how one is designed, you maybe not so sure. So hopefully this will teach you something new, give you a bit of taster of what a lecture or workshop might be like, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. This is something that I've been looking at a lot over the past sort of few weeks, in anticipation of teaching, just kind of learning a lot about the theories behind level design and why they're designed the way they are, and all this kind of stuff. And so I'm sharing that with you within this session. So what we're going to do in this short session is I want you to essentially design your own level for a fantasy game. Nothing too big, just a small sort of rough sketch of what a level might look like, and then we're going to apply something called the whiteboard test to our designs, and use that as a kind of barometer to see where we're at in terms of our level design skill level. Although I'm not expecting everyone to be obviously experts at this point, but it's a good way to kind of sort of see where we're at in terms of our current design knowledge. And then we're going to go through a few steps in which we can make our levels more interesting. So the first thing I'd like you to do is just grab a piece of paper and a pen and just spend a few minutes coming up with a design for a level for a game. So in this scenario, you have to get, it's not an online deathmatch level or anything like that. It's for a kind of single player narrative driven game that's set in a fantasy or medieval village kind of setting. So think like your Skyrim, your Oblivion, that kind of location. And you essentially have to get the player from point A to point B, and think about what structures are there, what routes they might take, and all this kind of stuff. So essentially I want you to draw maybe a square like in the example on the slide there, and draw where point A and point B is. Doesn't have to be exactly as it is on the square above me, and just spend a few minutes just sketching something out, and see what you can come up with. So at this moment, just pause the video and then spend as much as you like. Don't go too crazy, just a few minutes with a rough design. Okay, so by now you should have drawn your level design, and now what we're going to do is we're going to critique it. We're going to see, okay, in terms of the design of this level, how does it stack up against the whiteboard test? So the whiteboard test is something that was suggested by a game developer, and also a lecturer in game design called Robert Yang, and it's essentially differing levels of the concept is that a whiteboard test is something that if you wanted to get a job as a level designer in the games industry, they might ask you to do a whiteboard test, to sketch out a first person multiplayer level and then explain it. And then he sort of shows some examples, and what's wrong with each and how each one could be improved and things like that. We'll cover this in a bit more detail towards the end of the session. But I just wanted to sort of show you where this idea was from. We've kind of adapted this slightly because this was for a multiplayer map idea, whereas ours is a single player campaign. But the principle behind it is still the same. So let's take a look at some of the things that might have gone wrong with your designs. So here's an example of kind of like a rudimentary level design starting from point A to point B. And if we look at this and we think about what's wrong with this, what could be improved with it. So what a lot of beginners might do is not think about verticality at all. So by that I mean the level is just one flat plane, and that's exactly what we've got here. There's no stairs or indication of any height variation, and so the level is incredibly flat. And because of that, say our goal is like behind this wall or whatever, we're not going to see it from the start of the game. It's a good idea to make sure that the player's goal is visible. And so if everything's the same height level, they're not really going to see too much into the distance here with these buildings in the way blocking it. There's no kind of clear flow through this space. It's a little bit messy. The player could sort of go in any direction. They could go through the middle here. They could go around here. They could go travel upwards to this kind of dead end area and get lost. They could sort of loop back on themselves. There's no sense of direction. Also, there's no real variation of space. The space between the buildings is almost the same around this. And importantly, as well as inefficient use of space. So by that, what I mean is when you are developing a game, you ideally don't want to develop content that it is unlikely the player is going to see. So by that, I mean, in this case, a player could load into this map, walk straight through the middle of this section and to the goal. They're not going to see anything that's over here necessarily, and they may not see, this section up here. So this is all like assets that have been placed, time has been spent developing this, that's essentially going to go to waste because the player isn't going to see it. So there's something we can do about that. Also conforms to the grid a little too much. If you're familiar with game engines, you'll know that a lot of them use like a grid format. When you're placing structures down, you'll have this sort of grid. So if you imagine like some gridded paper, you're able to sort of snap objects to a grid so that it conforms nicely. But the trouble with that is you end up with a lot of like 90-degree angles. There's a little bit of moving away from that. This building and this building are on an angle, but it sort of feels like it conforms really too much to this sort of grid pattern. So let's look at some ways in which we can improve our initial level design ideas. So one thing that I kind of alluded to a second ago was verticality. Flat levels in games are boring. We want to be able to, especially if we're in a combat situation, it's good to allow the player to be able to view a group of a group of baddies or enemy NPCs that they're supposed to attack, without them seeing them first. Obviously, that's not the case all the time, but it sort of allows the player a bit of time to kind of get their bearings about the environment without being shot at or whatever or attacked, and they can come up with a strategy and a plan for tackling the enemies. If you think about like games like the Batman Arkham series that does this a lot, Batman will typically be able to climb up high and be able to view the surroundings and come up with a plan of attack and then execute that plan. So this screenshot shows slides from a GDC talk that I've taken that essentially was about the Armory section in Horizon Zero Dawn. I haven't played the game myself, but I thought the talk was interesting nonetheless. And they essentially talk about this section. This was the initial sort of level block out for that section of the game. The idea was this was a critical path. You come in this way, you're able to you have a fight with baddies, and then you leave this way. And then you have the option of going around and maybe trying to perform some sort of flanking maneuver. But among the many things the designer of this level kind of admits to being an issue with this, one of them was the lack of any kind of verticality. And so later on in the talk, they showed that same section, but it's much more improved. You may recognise this section if you've played the game, but this is what they kind of did. They, rather than allowing the player to go sort of straight down into it, they made them kind of go around this kind of U-bend staircase that kind of forces them to come around this corner and notice the fact that there's these bunkers that they can hide in, there's these ramps that they could climb up, and have another vantage point from up on top of this way. And I think you'll probably agree that it makes the level much more interesting. So if you're able to climb up and get more of a vantage point on any enemies within the scene, and as well you've got these interiors and exterior sections, which is something again we'll talk about in a little bit, about variety of space. The vantage points thing that I've just mentioned, they can sort of see where enemies are and come up with a plan of attack. So that's one thing that we can consider when you're sketching out an initial level idea. It's a good idea to include some verticality, sort of different varying heights of the level, rather than everything just being on one flat plane. Another thing that we can consider, so in our example bad layout, one of the things we talked about was insufficient use of space. So essentially with this one, the player can just waddle through the middle and just ignore any of the game that's on either side of this section. So this is a section from Half-Life 2. So you may have recognised the screenshot from the beginning slide. It's from an early chapter in the game called Root Canal. And so what I've done is I've sort of roughly sketched down a top-down view of one of the sections of the game. You enter through this up these stairs here, and you exit this section on this kind of pathway here. There's a train line through the centre, which is lower down than these two spaces. So you've got that verticality. You sort of come up these stairs. You're presented with the area. And then the idea is here as well, you've got this jump across this. When you get to the stairs, you start travelling down them. A train starts to travel down here, and you're supposed to jump across the top of the train to get to the other side. So there's a bit of platforming in there as well. But the concept is that this space essentially uses a similar shape to what we have just tried to design our level around. We've tried to create a square with an entrance and an exit, and have a player move around that space. So with this being Half-Life 2, they've done the same thing, but they have made use of looping around the level and zigzagging around the level in order to make the most efficient use of that space. So if we look at this map, which shows you the route that the player has to take in order to reach the exit. So they essentially have to come up these stairs. There's a couple of dead ends behind them, so they may travel that way. There may be some ammo or health or whatever on there. But if not, they'll come up here. There's another dead end here, and then around there there's the stairs that they'll notice. Traveling down that causes the train to move along. They jump across, and they can't access this section because it's fenced off here. And then as they sort of get to this area, they start getting shot at by enemies that have appeared from behind them, and so that kind of causes that kind of fight reflex. They can start shooting at them, but their only cover is to go into this house. That's when they kind of see that, okay, I can't go anywhere from in here, so they travel to the next room, and again the only exit from this space is to this bottom right yard. They travel then behind the house before looping sort of back around themselves again, and being able to go through a hole in this fence to the exit of this section of the level. So if you take away all the detail and just focus on the route they've taken through this giant square, you can see that they've not been able to just go straight to level. They've sort of had to zigzag and loop and go around and make effective use of the space. Half-Life 2 does this a lot with their level designs. There's the shanty town section later on in this before they get onto the hoverboat, and again you're kind of zigzagging around this space, and there's plenty of opportunities for that. But essentially this makes efficient use of the space because you are forcing the player to maneuver around and travel back on themselves, and it kind of feels a bit more like a real space. Sometimes you travel from A to B, you can't just go in a straight line. You've got to, sometimes there's some fence in the way, or you've got to go around a set of buildings, or there's some obstacle in the way that you've got to travel around, and you're looping back on yourself and all this kind of stuff. So again, this makes efficient use of space by forcing the player to visit all these different locations and areas within this square space. Obviously, in this example, this section isn't really used, but it's much better than this example from our whiteboard test. Another thing that we can do, we can think about in terms of our level design to make them more interesting, is narrow versus wide open spaces. Again, Half-Life 2 does this a lot. I'm not sure if there's any examples in this particular map, but certainly later on, you get sort of the sewer sections where you're going through sort of narrow corridors, then you'll come out onto wide open spaces. And what this does is, if you enter an open space from a narrow space, it makes that open space feel larger. It gives it more of a sort of sense of presence, and it kind of feels a bit more, it has more of a wow factor than if you were just traveling from large space to large space. Coming from a small space to a large space has more impact, certainly. This is just a snapshot from a game that I think does this fairly well. So Skyrim, this is Bleak Falls Barrow. It's one of the earlier potential maps that the player is able to travel to in the game. So essentially they enter this location here. It's quite a wide open space. They then got to travel into narrow corridors. Then they get to sort of this section here, and because they've been in these smaller hallways and corridors, even though this section isn't that big, it still has that impression. And you'll see that they use this sort of pattern again and again. So you've got small corridors, a larger space, even smaller corridors again. This section's, a lot of zigzagging as well, making efficient use of the space again. So you can see how here, obviously, the quickest route would have possibly have been to just travel through this way, or even being able to travel up into this section from here, but they've forced the player to zigzag around. And again, there's a lot of verticality in these levels as well. But yeah, and especially when they reach this section, so this door, they access this area here. They're traveling through narrow spaces. This is a really narrow space. Then it opens up into this really wide space, makes it feel a lot grander. And then again, narrow spaces before exiting into the actual open world. Give that sense of, okay, I've been in a narrow space and an open world again. Not only does it make the bigger spaces seem more impressive, but it offers some variety in the space there. So you're not just in the same space environment, you're going in sort of big, small, and it's more interesting if there's a bit more variety to it. I think this one is probably the last point that I'll talk about in this session, but essentially this is about breaking away from that grid, and not all angles are 90-degree angles. Again, this is from an early section in Half-Life 2, the root canal section. So this is further on than the map that I showed you earlier. But you can see here that you start at number 1 here, and it's not conforming to 90-degree shapes. You've got like 45-degree angles, and then it kind of zigzags up here. Then you've got another offshoot. A lot of the times games will conform to a grid of some sort, but this is an example where they've broke away from that structure. And again, when you're playing a game, if you've played enough games, you'll become very aware of the whole 90-degree angle structure, because it's easier to design levels that way in editors. Breaking away from those 90-degree angles can cause sort of issues with grid placements and all sorts of stuff. But you can see how Half-Life 2 wasn't afraid to embrace that and have these, especially with this section here as well, which is after this one. You've even got these kind of these circular corridors that would have been particularly quite difficult to place. But it's more impressive, and also again that theme of variety and having the player interact with different spaces is important, and making the game feel a bit more exciting. As you can see with the Skyrim map, this one very much does conform to a grid of sorts. You can see how most of the time, it's just corners, moving around corners again, lots of 90-degree corners. It's very rare that you'll have even this section, which you could argue is goes around like a 45-degree bend. It's mainly just one big 90-degree angle there, and again, more sort of 90-degree stuff. I think this is the problem with a lot of maps in Skyrim and Fallout and maybe other Bethesda titles. They very much stick to this modular design approach, where they've got corners that they follow and they move around a certain plot, and you can put them together, put levels together quite quickly. But the downside is it's very grid like very conforming to a grid and this kind of block structure. So that's a criticism of this space, I guess, but obviously Half-Life 2 doesn't do that. It meaningfully sort of breaks away from the grid, makes up for a more interesting space. So again, if we were to have another go at this level design test where we're trying to create a map where you get from A to B in a small medieval village, I had another go at it using these principles, and I think this is a much better level design. So we've got verticality straight away, and you can see that there's different levels to this. It might be a bit difficult to see. It might just be like a load of squiggly lines to you, but I'll try and explain it as best I can. So you start on the lower section of the map, then these stairs move you up another height. So all this sort of section is on another level. These stairs kind of lead to another section, and then finally this is meant to be like a hill, and this section is quite high up on a hill. So then that means that the goal point, where this could be, I don't know, it's some sort of a windmill maybe, is up on a hill. So you're at the bottom of this area and you can clearly see the goal, and it's visible from a lot of places around the map because it's so high up. The pathways are clear, so this one, which had no kind of clear go this way, go that way, you can see the fact that we've got the steps, and we've got kind of other landmarks that kind of fit the theme of like village. We can sort of see, okay, the proposed space, the way you would go is you would go up these stairs, and then you would have access to these stairs, and there's more of a clear pathway. In my example here, what I've done is just put a big X on these stairs because I was thinking, well, we'll have some sort of set piece. Maybe you try and come to this section and then a boulder falls down and destroys the stairs and you can't access them anymore and you've got to find a different route. So you'll maybe wander around, and then might eventually, because this is meant to be like a church and these like gravestones, you might eventually, from this point you might look through here. Maybe this section is well lit and it shows these ladders moving up to this higher point, so you might think, oh, I need to try and get to that ladder. You can't get through this way, so maybe eventually you'll find your way down here where you're able to move between this narrow section. Maybe this section's got some covering over it as well. Again, using that variety in space, having this kind of wide open area, and then you're moving into these like narrow sections. Then you've got a section which is like littered with gravestones. You've got to navigate those. Another sort of narrow section before it opens up again. So I'm trying to sort of break it up for the player and make it a bit more exciting. Landmarks for navigation. So obviously the church is quite unique. I think up here we've got some sort of fortress. I don't really know, I was just kind of sketching around. But yeah, once the player's made it through the graveyard and around the back of the church to climb this ladder, then there's a drop down onto this section. So maybe this is like a watchtower or something, I don't know. But there's the idea of not just having the verticality, just make the player move up and up, but make them move up and down as well. Again, variety is key if you want to try and make these spaces more interesting. Then the player would travel along this kind of like path underneath this cliff and above the other section, eventually making it to a looping back. So again, this concept of zigzagging and looping, which we've seen in the Half-Life 2 levels. They would come around here, the stairs would break, then they kind of go back on themselves, they're zigging-zagging around, and then looping back again to where they would have been. Maybe there's a gap. This is like a fortress type thing. There's some way that, like, I don't know, sewer grate or something. They can make it into here, travel through this section. Maybe there's some more narrow bits and pieces, and then eventually they make their way up this hill to the final goal. And again, I've tried to break away from the grid. So yes, I've got some sort of 90-degree bits and pieces, but also sections that don't necessarily follow that, like these buildings and these structures are away from it, and the hill shape as well is kind of sort of circular almost, to kind of to break free from that as well. So hopefully you'll agree that this kind of map is a big improvement on this kind of map, and you'll be able to do something similar with your own designs. So going back to the whiteboard test from Robert Yang, he sort of argues that a beginner map would be this overcomplicated, structureless mess that the person has probably never tried to build it in a level editor. There's no clear flow, differentiation, no attempts to break line of sight. So what they mean by that is if you can sort of see far off into the distance in a game, that becomes a problem, because ideally you only want to load into the game stuff that's directly around them that they can see. So you don't want the player to be able to sort of see too much of the environment, because you're having to load in all the objects or the grass or the props and everything. If you can break their line of sight, it means that you don't necessarily have to load in parts of the map until they move around a corner, and then you can load it in and then remove the previous section, and it becomes a lot more optimized. We're starting to worry about that less and less now as technology advances, but that's what he's talking about here. Intermediate would be understanding and design theory, very boxy floor plan. Again, lots of 90-degree angles here. Room, hallway. So he's going for the narrow to big open space, but maybe there's a bit too much of it. Then more advanced is starting to try and break away from the grid, but it's kind of like a pattern of 45-degree angle, then another one here, sort of matching. And then the expert level is kind of, round edges, meaningfully breaking away from this grid, because obviously, real life building structures are not all 90-degree angles. They do kind of break away from that. Careful use of symmetry, pretty simple, breaks the line of sight into certain sections, so you can sort of see the progression from beginner to intermediate, advanced and expert. But again, adding in all that stuff that we're talking about, or some of them at least, particularly adding in verticality, breaking away from the 90-degree angles, having the different differentiation in the types of spaces that you've got, etc. So he kind of says this is like Uncharted 4 level, or a recent CSGO map. So hopefully, if you look at your own sketches and you apply that test to them, you can kind of see where you might make improvements. And that's what this short session has really been about. So in terms of some additional tasks additional objectives for you, you can maybe redesign the space that you've done using the kind of principles that we've talked about in this video. You can think about these principles in the games that you play. So the next time you load up a level, think about how they have varying size spaces, think about how they use height variation, think about how they kind of force the player to zigzag around and make effective, efficient use of the space, and think about all these other things and how they break away from the 90-degree angles of the level design. And then finally, if you want a real challenge, download Unreal Engine 4 or Unity and block out a level for yourself. I'd probably go with Unreal Engine 4 if it's specifically level block out that you want to do. It's free and kind of looks like this. So this is an example of a level block out. You can see a kind of little bridge here. They've got different structures to move around. And it might be that you redesign your space using the principles we talked about, then download Unreal Engine and block it out in any engine. That would be really cool if you were able to do that. Something to do over the summer perhaps. But yeah. Hopefully you've learned something from this, and you've sort of picked up on how we might start critiquing and analysing the games that we're playing, and how we can better learn from them when we're trying to construct our own designs for levels. And using those principles, hopefully, the next time you sketch out a level design, you can think about doing it in a more interesting way. So again, that's the end of this session. Hopefully you enjoyed it and learnt something. And if you want to get in touch with me, or maybe you want to send me a drawing of the level that you've done, or a screenshot from within Unreal, more than happy to take a look at that and maybe offer some comments or feedback. Or better yet, show me a video of it being played, or send me a playable build that I can play myself. That's my office in campus, but obviously we're not on campus much at the minute. So if you want to get in touch with me, any comments or questions, that's my email address. And again, thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed it.